In graph 9.5, we showed how the supply curve for capital can emerge from the savings behavior of individuals who plan for the future. In graph 9.6, we showed how a demand curve for capital can emerge from borrowers who borrow on future income to consume more now. In the first case, we assumed that the saver is earning all of his income now and no income in the future. In the second case, we assumed that the borrower is earning all of his income in the future and none of it now. We'll now consider an intermediate case, where someone is earning some income now and some income in the future, and has to decide whether to borrow or to save. If the consumer earns income now and in the future, his endowment bundle will lie somewhere in the interior of the graph. Here we've placed the endowment bundle such that the consumer is currently earning income I1, and in the future will be earning income I2. This is the consumer's endowment bundle because no matter what the interest rates are, the consumer can always consume this bundle, because at this consumption bundle, the consumer has to neither borrow nor save. At any interest rate, the intertemporal budget for this consumer will therefore pass through bundle E and will start with a magenta budget constraint that assumes a relatively low interest rate. If the consumer were to choose a bundle to the right of bundle E, the consumer would be borrowing on the future because he would be consuming more than he's currently earning. If he chooses a bundle to the left of E, the consumer would be saving because he would be consuming less than what he's earning now, which means the difference is going into a savings account. Suppose, for instance, that this consumer initially optimizes at bundle B to the right of E. The difference between his current consumption and his current income is therefore the amount that he is borrowing. Now suppose that the interest rate goes up, which means the intertemporal budget constraint will become steeper, but it'll rotate through bundle E. If that increase in the interest rate is steep enough, it might then be that the consumer switches from being a borrower to being a saver by now optimizing at a bundle S that lies to the left of E. That bundle involves less consumption now than current income, and therefore the difference between those two is the amount that this consumer would now be saving. On the lower graph, we now want to represent both borrowing and savings, and we'll use the following trick to do it. We'll place the vertical axis that measures the interest rate right below I1, the income that the consumer has in period 1. Anything to the right of that will be labeled borrowing. Anything to the left of it will be labeled savings, which is equal to negative borrowing. At the initial bundle B, the consumer borrows the difference between CB and I1. Thus we can drop bundle B down to the lower graph and place it at the level of the initially low interest rate to indicate that at that low interest rate, the consumer is borrowing that amount. At the high interest rate on the blue intertemporal budget, the consumer optimizes at S, where the savings that the consumer puts aside is the difference between CS and I1. We can therefore again drop bundle S down to the lower graph and indicate that at the high interest rate, the consumer is saving that amount. Or put differently, the consumer is borrowing a negative amount of that magnitude, which is the same as saying that's how much the consumer is saving. Connecting points S and B in the lower graph, we can then illustrate how the consumer responds to changes in the interest rate. When the interest rate is low, the consumer borrows. As the interest rate rises, the consumer borrows less. Eventually, the interest rate rises to the point where the relationship crosses the vertical axis, and therefore the consumer neither borrows nor saves. Then, if the interest rate rises further, the consumer begins to save. When individuals earn income now and in the future, it's therefore quite plausible that they might switch between borrowing and saving as the interest rate changes. What we've illustrated here is that this consumer will be a saver for high interest rates and a borrower for low interest rates. We could then ask if this relationship could ever be reversed. In other words, could it ever be the case that someone starts out as being a borrower at a high interest rate, and then, when the interest rate drops, the person becomes a saver? Or could it be that the person starts being a saver at a low interest rate, and then as the interest rate rises, the person becomes a borrower? This is, in fact, one of the within-chapter exercises, and you should be able to convince yourself that that's, in fact, not possible. The switching from borrowing to saving always happens when the interest rate rises. It never happens that when the interest rate rises, someone would switch from being a saver to being a borrower.